So Paul Vignon, the French scholar, began to characterize the facial attributes: the square cornered U between the eyebrows, the downward pointing triangle at the bridge of the nose, the raised right eyebrow, the accents on the cheeks, one a little higher than the other. Someone had carefully looked at what was on the shroud, and they made changes in the icons to fit that. So here's an example of a coin. This is the one I'm passing around, 969 AD. And here are some of the facial features. This one is, you can say, I believe this is from Daphne, Greece, near Athens. This is around 1100 AD. Another image of the Pantocrator. This one is from the Dome of Cephalou in Sicily. One further interesting detail worth mentioning in connection with icons is that the figure in the lower legs, the hands, and the torso of the image of the shroud convey a well-muscled person around 5'10", 5'11", 170 to 185 pounds, with longer than average limbs proportionally to his body, particularly his fingers. This is interesting because anatomically it's possible, but we know in iconography that in the Byzantine style there's an elongation in the fingers, and the shape of the icons are not supposed to, in classic iconography, not supposed to look like a natural kind of picture, because we're not to be drawn to the beauty of the natural flesh itself, but to see through the icon a transfigured life. So it's interesting that the icons themselves distort the body, and the shroud, the body is distorted. In the 6th century in Spain, a typicon for worship existed which was called the Mosarebic Rite. And one of the readings that's used during Pascha concerned the finding of the empty tomb states that Peter and John ran to the tomb and they, quote, saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. So here we have a liturgical reference, 6th century, written into the typicon of what appears to be the shroud. St. John Damascene writes in 730 in his anti-iconoclastic movement thesis on holy images. He describes an oblong grave cloth which he had himself experienced, and this may be the first mention of it in the manuscripts that are historically extant, of the shroud being an actual grave cloth. Another witness from this time, Pope Stephen III, this was in 752, writes that Christ had spread out his entire body on a linen cloth that was as white as snow, and on this cloth, marvelous as it is to see, the glorious image of the Lord's face and the length of his entire and most noble body has been divinely transferred. 200 years later, August 15, 944, there's another reference to the cloth known as the cloth of Edessa, which was again rediscovered. It was found concealed behind stones above the city gates, and it was removed from Edessa to Constantinople by the Emperor Romanus I, who sent an army to Edessa to remove it and transfer it to the capital. And it remained there for the next 250 years and then disappeared again, this time during the sacking of the city of Constantinople by the Knights of the Fourth Crusade. I guess everybody knows that history of how the Fourth Crusade went in and ransacked Constantinople after they'd been in Jerusalem. Just before this, in 1201, Nicholas Messerides, who was the sacristan of the Pharaoh's chapel where the image of Edessa was kept, describes a ceremony that used to occur during Pascha. He says, Here he rises again, and the shroud is clear proof, still smelling fragrant with perfumes, defying corruption, because they wrap the mysterious naked body from head to feet. Now that was 1,200 years later. The aloes and whatever spices may have been there were long gone. So if this was fragrant, it wasn't fragrant from perfumes. It was fragrant in the way tears of a weeping icon are fragrant, or the way the myrrh gushing from the relics of St. Demetrius or St. Nicholas are fragrant. I have some tears given to me by one of the monks at St. Anthony's from a weeping icon that I've had for some time. And someone else had given me a cotton with some perfumed oil on it. And the cotton with the perfumed oil on it now smells like nothing. It's gone. But the tears from the icon are as fragrant as they were the first time he gave it to me. It's a very interesting phenomenon. One of the things that the shroud and what the shroud represents does is question us about the nature of reality, the way the tears of the icons do. If we live in a materialistic universe where science is the ultimate tribunal of reality, then these things cannot be accepted. Because if there is an uncreated life, if God is uncreated, and grace is uncreated, and tears multiply out of nowhere, then we're dealing with something that is bigger than the paradigms we currently operate under within at least Western culture. So we have a long ways to go to see the unity between these two. There's a nurse that I used to work with, and I have a picture of the Holy Theotokos and the Christ child that appeared on a blank wall when a picture was taken during an apparition of the Theotokos in Bosnia, and the children all said, "This is exactly what we see." Well, I put this in her hands, and when I told her this, she sort of went like this and gave it back to me real quick and moved on to another subject. And I said to her, "What happened? What just happened there?" And she couldn't deal with the fact that this was challenging the reality she knew as a very grounded nurse, matter of fact. She handles business. If this thing were true, it upsets her world. So she just blipped right over it, gives it back to me, and was going to go right on without any discussion. How often in our life do we do that? With God dropping something in our lap, but this part says, "Oh, no." This is one of the questions raised for us here. So when the holy relics were taken by the Fourth Crusades, it's written that the Venetians partitioned the treasures of gold, silver, and ivory from Constantinople, while the French did the same with the relics of the saints, and the most sacred of all, the linen in which our Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped after his death before his resurrection. So we have multiple references to the shroud as the cloth of Christ that the church has accepted for centuries. Now, this is a picture of where Edessa, ancient Edessa, the wall, it's now modern Urfa. It's located in Turkey. And it's been a town that's been inhabited since 2,000 years before Christ. Tradition associates it with the legendary King Nimrod, and Muslim legend associates it with the birthplace, or the place of Abraham. They believe that Abraham's birthplace was a cave beneath Urfa, the citadel of Urfa. It may well be related in Aramaic to which changed to Edessa when it was refounded as a military settlement in the 3rd century. Since neither Latin nor Greek was understood, the native language Syriac, which is related to Aramaic, was used in Christian writings. And the political fortunes of Edessa present quite a contrast to the rest of Christian sinners because it lay outside the Roman Empire, so it wasn't destroyed. So now, a Vatican document written in Greek says that Gregory Referendarius, the Archdeacon of Hagia Sophia Cathedral in Constantinople, described the arrival of the cloth of Constantinople in a full-length image with bloodstains from a side wound. So, that's some of the history. Now, 2,000 years later, we suddenly have the possibility of studying this scientifically, and now a new witness arises. Let's see here. Blood is at the heart of Jewish life. It's the sign of the Passover. It governs the slaughtering of animals and the preparation of food, and it determines what food is clean and unclean. It's all based on the blood. The statement, "His blood be upon us and upon our children," has in history been used as a rallying cry for anti-Semitism, as Christ killers. This is wrong. Humanity rejected the Son of God. It's an ironic prophecy in which we who are his murderers are cleansed and forgiven by his blood. All of us are in need of mercy, and his death continues today. Every sin against anyone, anywhere, is against Christ. There's an interesting quote from a C.S. Lewis book, Mere Christianity, which I like, because it really lifts up the strangeness of Jesus forgiving sins committed against other people. He says, "We can all understand how someone forgives offenses that occurred against himself. You tread on my toes, I forgive you. You steal my money, I forgive you. But what should we make of a man who himself is not robbed, who's not stepped on, and he announces that he forgives you for stepping on another man's feet and stealing another man's money?" Asinine fatuity is the kindest description that we could give of such conduct. Yet this is what Jesus did. He told people that their sins were forgiven, and he never waited to consult all the other people whom their sins had undoubtedly injured. He unhesitatingly behaved as if he was the party chiefly concerned, the person chiefly offended by all the offenses. This makes sense only if Jesus really was God, whose laws are broken and whose love is wounded by every sin. Otherwise, it's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. So when we pray, "He's in all places and fills all things," this is true. How many of you have heard of St. John Climacus, St. John of the Ladder? Okay, a couple of you. I want to tell you something about that. Archimandrite Zacharias of Essex, one of Father Sophroni's monks, summarized the teaching on love from St. John. We're going to talk about this tomorrow when we talk about passion bearing, but let me just say that what he says is there's 4 stages. The first one is when someone hurts you, you don't hurt them back. The second one is when they hurt you, you pray for them. The third one is when they hurt you, you hurt for the pain they caused themselves by what they did to you. And the fourth one is when someone hurts you, you take responsibility for what they did to you. Now, those last 2 are really, if we tried to do that on our own, we'd end up in the psychiatric hospital. And yet this is what Christ does. So to move from praying for the other to the point of feeling pain for the other, what they've done to themselves by hurting you, and then ultimately taking responsibility for that, can only happen charismatically. from beyond our power, from being the indwelling of Christ who begins to be the life that we live together. Then already, if this is being asked of us as Christians, offered us, we're into an amazing territory that goes beyond our biological determinism into something that is a relationship far beyond what we can do on our own power. All right, so if his blood be upon us and upon our children is a prophetic word. And now Christ, the Passover Lamb, heals us by the blood that we have shed of his. We do something to him, and instead of doing anything back, he prays for us. He hurts for the pain that we're in, the sickness of our sin. And he ultimately heals us with the blood that comes from him when we kill him. This is a view of the dorsal, the back side of the person on the shroud. And you can see the way the marks fall, that the person was lashed 120 times. Now, Jewish law permits 39. This person was beat up and down the back and the buttocks. And the instrument of torture was a Roman flagrum, which is I'll show you a picture in a minute. It rips the flesh open and causes intense pain to the point of seizures, tremors, vomiting, and cold sweats. There's a piece of metal on the end, digs in. So the figure in the shroud is beat up and down. Here's what they know was used. This kind of torture was terrible. Church historian Eusebius writes an eyewitness account and says, veins were laid bare, and the very muscles, sinews, and bowels of the victim were open to exposure by this kind of beating. In Deuteronomy 25:3, it's stated that the lashes had to be limited to 40, and no instruments resembling the Roman flagrum were ever used. So you have 3 times what could have been done under Jewish law were done to this man. Roman law had no limit to how many times you could beat a person. So one thought is that Pilate attempted to beat him bad enough that he didn't have to crucify him, because there's suggestions in the New Testament that he was uncomfortable about it. But if he were going to do that, perhaps he tried to satisfy them. Why would he do that? What would have led to that many whippings? There's a swelling over the right cheekbone and over the nose, which appears to have hit the ground in a fall or been hit with a fist. The septum, which is the cartilage in the nose, is broken. Now, no bones are broken in the body, but the cartilage is. It's pulled off. The evidence of a crown of thorns is present, as well as the 120 scourge marks on the back, buttocks, and legs. And there are none on the chest. Anybody have an idea? What would you speculate is the reason they didn't beat him on the chest?
He was on the ground already?
Say that again?
He was on the ground already?
He was probably tied to that post, so they could have done it, yes.
They wanted him alive, they didn't want him
Right.
hurt.
Yes, if they had done that to the heart, it would have killed him. So they only beat him on the side that would keep him alive. They tortured him and allowed him to stay alive. Let's see here. Okay. Now, in the year 1520 to 1560, repairs were made to a corner of the shroud, which was used in the 1988 carbon-14 dating. It's known that at that time there existed some 30 to 40 master weavers throughout France, any one of whom would have been capable of combining materials of that day with the ancient linen so as to be almost undetectable. The tapestry in the Renaissance art, and there's books that speak about this. Let me see. Under a microscope, here's an example of what it would look like. Now, strangely, for whatever reason, when they did the carbon dating, they got a piece that had both. And this has been proven now. In December of 2003, a skeptical chemist named Ray Rogers was able to obtain some material from the carbon-14 sample that had not been used. And he was very skeptical and wanted to prove that the carbon dating was accurate. That was his hope. He found that threads encrusted with a plant gum containing a dye that was extracted from a madder root, Eurasian herb, that's used in Turkish carpets to give them a certain color. And when this is mixed in there, it makes it look aged like the linen. So they used a beta analytic estimate of the fibers that showed 60% were 16th century, 40% from 1st century would yield a 13th century date. As it turns out, that's what they had done, and he ended up publishing his work in Thermochemica Acta in 2005. This is not the sort of journal that any of us would read except the man with the tie in the back with the chemicals on it. It's a very sophisticated peer-reviewed journal on this. And in the case of the shroud, what was dated in 1988 was confused because they had mixed the two. So, what he writes is, now he used chemical kinetics, analytical chemistry, found that, and pyrolysis, I don't know all these things that he did, but what he found was, in the shroud, there's another way to date it, not just carbon. The shroud is made of flax, and this has a plant. This is a plant which has a certain chemical called lignin. And like carbon-14, it deteriorates over time in a predictable manner with a certain temperature. So if the linen fibers from the shroud had in fact been of medieval origin, as the cotton fibers were, then you could tell by the vanillin, which is a quality of the flax, the lignin, how much was in it. You could tell what its date was. So vanillin is present, for example, in medieval origins, linens, but it's not found in those that are 1,300 years earlier, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Rogers notes that linen produced in 1260 would have retained about 37% of its vanillin in 1978, but the threads that were in the shroud did not have any of this. So, from that standpoint, the shroud was much older. According to the textile expert Mathilde Fleury-Lindberg of Hamburg, a seam in the cloth corresponds to a fabric that's found only at the fortress of Masada, near the Dead Sea, which dates to the 1st century. The weaving pattern of 3-to-1 twill is consistent with the 1st century Syrian design. And according to Gilbert Reis of the Ghent Institute of Textile Technology in Belgium, the linen cloth of the Shroud of Turin does not display any weaving or sewing techniques which would speak against the origin of a high-quality product of workers from the 1st century. Now, here's another interesting discovery. There's a second face image on the opposite side of the shroud. So using computer-enhanced image analysis technology, it can be seen that this face matches the face on the other side, the entire body, exactly in every area. Now it's much fainter. You can't see it as well. But now there's a puzzle. On one side you have this very interesting image. And you have it on the other side, and there's no bleed through. Now these fibers are very fine, but it's only on the surface, and it has a thickness about the thickness of a soap bubble or what you have on sunglasses to make them non-glare. If you pull back the fibers and you can't find any image, then the question is, how did the image appear exactly the same on both sides? This certainly weighs against someone having forged it. Why would they bother to do that? Why would they even try to copy it? And even if they did, how would they get it that exact? Modern science offers multiple ways to totally rule out artistic forgery. CSI-type forensics tests using ultraviolet and infrared spectrometry, X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, thermography, and a whole bunch of other kinds of tests show that there are no images painted on the shroud. It is the spectral analysis and wet chemistry tools of forensic science show that the brown coloring of the images are composed of starch fractions and saccharides. Now, this is an interesting thing. What is starch doing on the shroud? Sugars from the starch. Well, Pliny the Elder, from 23 to 77 AD, same time as Christ, an early Roman author, writes that starch was used in his day to render linen fibers more flexible so they would be easier to work with. After the cloth had been woven, it was then cleaned in order to remove the starch. As the linen cloth dried in the open air and the sunlight, the sugars in the starch would form a very sheer film on each side of the cloth. Presumably, the side facing the sun dried the quickest and would retain most of the starch, hence a thicker film of sugar on one side of the cloth than the other. But, okay, these clues, what difference would this make? It's possible that since sugar remains on it, guess what happens with protein breakdown in a dead body when it connects with those sugars? It turns them brown. So medieval linen made from flax doesn't use the process of putting the starch on it. They don't have any starch in medieval linens. But they did do that in the first century. In Jesus' time, it was common among first century Jews, as among Orthodox monastics today, to bury the dead and then dig them up after decompensation to see if that had taken place or to get the bones. So the shroud that covered Jesus may be the only such linen cloth from that time that was taken off the body before it decomposed. But because the body was dead, the vapors of the deterioration from the proteins in the body already began to escape during the 3 days that the shroud was on the body. And when they contacted the starch, it was like a photographic plate. So the melanoidins, the brown, which is in beer and brown toast, this is one explanation of how the image was made. The image is, there are lots of, some people want to say it was radiation, that it was a light, it's unexplainable. I don't know. I like this myself. It's a very interesting thing. But then you have to also explain, why is the image not distorted some? Why does the buttocks not flatten out on the back? This leads people to say, well, he had to have been off the stone when the image was made. It's a flash of light. It's just unclear. But what is clear is that we have a photograph of a man who was dead, and this photograph should have decomposed. We should never have it. And it was an unclean thing. There are all kinds of reasons why we shouldn't have this. And we sure wouldn't expect 2,000 years later to be bringing all of this kind of study to suddenly illumine this icon, this relic. Another peculiarity of the shroud is that you can get three-dimensional details from it. You can't get this from photographs and from pictures or drawings. But the shroud, even though it's on just the surface, has in it enough for a computer to give a three-dimensional image from it. Well, when they started looking at that, they discovered something else over the eyes that was unexpected. In 1980, Francis Philos at Loyola University and Michael Marks, an expert in classical coins, examined the area over the right eye, and they detected patterns of what looked to be letters. UCAI from Tiberius Caesar. They also found a litus, a little staff, auger's staff of an ancient Roman priest who divined the will of God with the staff, and concluded that this was from the lepton coin minted by Pontius Pilate between 29 and 32 AD. This was over the left eye. So there's two different types of coins. One is in honor of Caesar, his wife, Julia, and the other, Caesar. Both minted by Pontius Pilate. And I was really interested in this, and I was able to get one of these from a biblical coin expert. And I'll pass that around to you too, because what this is, you'll be holding in your hands, is a coin minted by Pontius Pilate. I think it's from 30 AD. This was unexpected because they have found some coins in skulls from that time, which raises the question, was that put under the tongue? Was it put in the eyes? Because you only have the skull and you don't know. But here, you have it over the eyes. And if God wanted a witness for a period of time when people had lived 2,000 years after this miracle and had some wonderment about it, placing coins that were minted by Pontius Pilate over the eyes to date it, to tag it, to let us know when it happened, is a pretty wondrous little detail. These coins were minted at the time that the Gospels give us the crucifixion historically. So the man in the shroud, we can assume, died during the time of Pontius Pilate. Probably people weren't running around with Pontius Pilate coins, hundreds of years later. That's what the litus looks like, the augur staff being held in the hands of the soothsayer, and 74 points of congruence with the existing litus. The coin that I've passed around has been found through the special photography. Now this is a piece of travertine aragonite limestone. Even stones will cry out if the people fail to. And now this is happening. In the ancient first century cemeteries of Jerusalem, there's a stone that's used which is unique to that area. It's this particular type of stone. If the shroud was placed in a burial chamber in the old city of Jerusalem, it would have this type of dust on it somewhere. This is particularly significant in that such stone is not known as existing anywhere else in the world except the old burial place of Jerusalem. Joseph Kolbach at the Hercules Aerospace Center in Utah and Richard Levi Setti of Enrico Fermi Institute at the University of Chicago compared dirt samples taken from the shroud with samples of this rare calcite rock, travertine aragonite, and they found near the Damascus Gate area in Jerusalem. And the chemical signatures of the shroud samples and of the dust found near Golgotha were an identical match. Currently, there's no known place in the world that this exists other than there. flowers also suggest something about the shroud. Look at those pollen grains and how unique they are, like a fingerprint. See, you're not just guessing. If you look at that, you're finding something of extraordinary detail. Pollen identification is a common method used in criminal forensics to determine where an object has been geographically. Max Frey, a Zurich criminologist, had identified 58 different pollen grains on the shroud. Some of them are native to the Dead Sea, the Negev Desert, the Anatolian steppes of western Turkey, which would be Edessa, the immediate environs of Constantinople, and Western Europe. It's a virtual chronology of the shroud's historical passage as best we can piece it together. The pollen grains relative to the zones of Palestine and Edessa were found that suggested a confirmation of the historical route. Well, you can get even more specific than just knowing where it was, because these flowers are very unique. Chrysanthemum coronarium is one of the most prominent pollen spores found on the shroud. It's a Mediterranean species. It's not so helpful in locating the shroud to Jerusalem, but it is a very good temporal indicator, because this particular flower blooms in the spring between March and May. So its presence on the shroud suggests that the image was formed when the shroud was exposed to air during this period. Cistus creticus, there are numerous grains of this found on the shroud. This is a highly specific geographical indicator, and it only grows in Israel along the Mediterranean coast and in higher elevations east of the coast, but only as far as the old city of Jerusalem. So we have the month, the place, and now, can you believe it? The hour. Capparis aegyptia is the most important pollen spore of all. This plant only grows in Israel, Jordan, and Sinai. This means when it corresponds to the opening of buds precisely at 3 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This is only this time that it opens. So it pinpoints a moment in time where the shroud would have had to have been exposed to the air at precisely the time when the Gospels say that Jesus died and was removed from the cross. Now, if it's a forger, he's pretty good. Had to go out and find those, had to go all over the world to find those spores and get them on there. Be sure they lasted that long. Now the oak tree, Romans typically tied the patibulum, the top part of the cross, to the wrists of the person who had to carry it naked to where they were going to be crucified. This was to shame them and humiliate them because the Romans totally dominated their enemy. Now the shroud suggests bruising on the left shoulder blade. There was an open wound on the right shoulder that was consistent with having carried about 125 pound weight. And oak cells have been found in the back where this would have laid on the shoulders and the head. Oak was at that time the most common tree in Palestine, so it's quite likely that that's what the patibulum was made of. So here's another verification. Roman citizens were exempt from crucifixion because it was regarded as a form of oppression and a sign of imperial power, and a disregard for the conquered peoples of occupied provinces. So you see Cicero's statement, to bind a Roman citizen is a crime. To flog him is an abomination. To kill him is almost an act of murder. But to crucify him, what? There is no fitting word that can possibly describe so horrible a deed. After 2,000 years and many necklaces and things we wear around our necks, we don't realize so much that we have an electric chair hanging around our neck. something very gruesome and horrible and shameful that would, you have to ask yourself, if somebody came along and challenged orthodoxy, and the clergy, the archbishop, and the United States government both agreed he was a criminal, and they executed him in the most horrible way, how many of us would have confidence enough in the invisible, heart-known faith to go against our government and our tradition? This is how extraordinary what the apostles and the witnesses of Christ did in changing and following. And you can begin to appreciate the situation that Peter and the others were in, not to deny him, or to deny him, because look what they were up against. Would you be willing to be thrown out of your church, be an enemy of the state, the United States, and have your family turn against you because you're following some kind of criminal who's been dragged through the streets naked? What's the matter with you? Before we go to John Calvin's objection, which I like to put on there, let me say something about blood and DNA. The examination of the blood and the markings of the shroud revealed that the man's knees were bruised and they were scabbed over. His face was smashed in, both of which are congruent with the fact that he would have had his arms tied up like this. So if he fell, he couldn't stop himself. The only thing that could stop him was if his knees hit. He could have held himself up, but he would have fallen right over, right on his face. And the dirt that's in the shroud confirms, and the blood confirms these kinds of details. They can even tell that he had a fever and he was dehydrated. So in the walk with a 125-pound oak beam on his shoulders, having been beaten 120 times with the flagrum, dehydrated and with a fever, he's in trouble.